City Council Committee on Ordinances, Licenses, and Legal Affairs, co-posted with the Committee of the Whole, met in the council chambers on Wednesday, May 21st, 2025 at 6 p.m. for the purpose of discussing the matters listed. Discussing the matters listed below. Notice this meeting was posted on May 15th, 2025 at 3:42 p.m. Absent from the committee are Councilor Varela. From the Committee of the Whole, we have Councilors Davis, Councilor Merkel, and Councilor President Prosnewski, and Councilor Stott. From the city, we have Christina Hodge and Mayor Pangalo. I believe that's it. All right, so matters discussed tonight, the ordinance ordinance relative to Halloween parking overlay and an act relative to excise tax upon the transfer of parking spaces in the city of Salem. So I'll have, I guess, either Mayor Pangalo, and if you want to start things off, or Christina, do you have a preference? Mayor, if you want to just talk through the background of where we're at right now.
So I don't want to reprise kind of the presentation that was given during the public hearing, but so this is a proposal to expand the October parking overlay to the inclusive of the entire city and extend the provision to residential properties as well as commercial properties, with the exception of residential properties on resident restricted parking streets, so streets where resident parking is only permitted. The intention of this is to address both the existing practice of private property being rented out for public parking purposes, and also to accommodate the incoming traffic that we typically see in October. It's time limited just to the October season. There is a registration process, so it requires registration with the city, and then separately is the home rule petition requesting the ability to assess a surcharge of $2 per space per day for those who have registered property engaging in this activity. Really, I think this is prompted by a choice we have between two options. We can either ignore the cars that are coming to Salem. We don't have the public parking capacity to accommodate them generally, which results in significant congestion and gridlock, not just downtown, but also on our entry corridors and throughout the neighborhoods with the side streets that serve those corridors. Or we can choose to regulate it. So either way, we have to enforce a zoning ordinance, but only one of those options gives us the opportunity to structure rules and to generate revenue off the tourists that are coming to the community in a way that can help us meet some of our additional costs with not just October, but alternative transportation as we look at programs like Blue Bikes and the Salem Skipper, and the future availability of funding for those in question. We're trying to identify ways to export the costs for those services to visitors and specifically place it on people that choose to come here by passenger vehicle when they have public transportation options that we think are much more advantageous. The $2 rate, to get a question about that, it's identical to the rate that is charged for the convention center surcharge for similar parking in several communities in Massachusetts, Springfield, Worcester, and Boston, I believe. It is charged per space per day that's registered for simplicity of implementation, so we don't have to have any kind of oversight of the number of cars who actually park there. We just look at the registry that will be created through the permitting process and then establish how many days you are registering to rent out those 2 or 3 spaces, and then generate the revenue based on that. And then lastly, I'd say that we asked the people of Salem to put up with a lot in October, and a large number of our businesses are trying to maximize the revenue in that particular season, which is understandable. The city is seeking to do so as well, because we have costs related to public safety, public works, as we discussed during the Haunted Happenings meeting. I don't think it's a substantial overreach to allow residents in a regulated fashion to also have the same ability as many of these commercial properties do, and that the city certainly does in our own regulated parking lots. So that is the proposal. I understand it came back from the planning board. The zoning ordinance came back from the planning board with their favorable recommendation, and yeah, I think that about covers it.
Any questions, general questions for Mayor Pangala before we get into the specifics with Christina? Councilor Marcelo.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Pangalo, does the excise also cover parking lots?
It is, what do you mean, parking lots?
Well, you made, your description now made it sound very specific to private property driveway use. But does it cover the parking lots that are used, like
The city's parking lots?
insurance? No, Walsh Insurance, church parking lots. Okay. So even if they're being used for nonprofit, we're still asking for an excise? Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So the language in the home rule petition says that it applies to an operator registered with the city who transfers the right to use a parking space in return for consideration during the period of the ordinance.
Okay. And then part of the permitting process is you're specifying in the permit what days you're going to be using your parking lot for this purpose and the number of spaces. Okay. All right, thank you.
Councilor Jerslow.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor, does that include the city lots, the school lots? Like Bentley School? I know they use that. I'm not sure. I think they use Carlton School lot. How would you be able to put an excise on a city lot?
So I would verify that with the city solicitor. I don't believe that it would, but I think that's something that I would want to confirm with the solicitor before I gave you a definitive answer on it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the council? If you could talk through just, I know that the enforcement was one of the concerns. What are the anticipated needs on enforcement with the way this ordinance is changing with the resident-only parking streets?
So I think that so either way, whether there's an ordinance, a zoning ordinance allowing for this use or not, there's some enforcement mechanism that's required. If it's not an allowed use, it's a zoning violation. If it is an allowed use, then we can either enforce it as a zoning violation if they're not registered, or if they've registered improperly, then there's penalties under the ordinance that would follow. I think part of our goal is understanding through the registration process where these properties are, the number of allowed spaces, and the dates that the activity is taking place. And having that list will hopefully also reduce the number of calls to city enforcement inspectors to have to go and inspect those locations. If the public, if neighbors and residents are able to see, this property is registered, I'm not going to call. It's annoying, but I'm not going to call. This property is not registered, I am going to call, and that will, I think, hopefully address some of the enforcement challenges that would follow from having a program. From not having a program, it's kind of an open-ended, we have to enforce to the extent we're able whenever there's a zoning complaint. And that means that those inspectors, of whom we have only a handful, are spending their time checking on those locations to confirm any calls that come in saying this person is engaging in this activity.
So Councilor Cohen said that Councilor Varela is not able to log into the meeting right now. Can't think of any reason why somebody would not be able to log in. Yeah. Just on that same line of questioning, do you anticipate less enforcement needs with this change, or the same, or more? Do you have a thought on what that would look like?
I think because we would have greater transparency with the public around who in their neighborhood is allowed to be engaged in this kind of use, it would be a reduction in enforcement, not an increase.
Thank you. No, we have nobody logged in. I don't know what. I mean, a meeting in person is still the primary method. So if there's an issue with the link, then I don't know that we can do anything about that at this point. Any other questions for Mayor? Councilor Stott.
Thank you, Chair, not being a member of the committee. I had a question specifically related to the addition of the residential usage. I'll start this off by saying I'm in full support of making the overlay citywide. I think the lines were arbitrary. I think it was a benefit to have those additional private lots throughout the city, specifically to North Salem. I am curious about the community dialogue that went into increasing or allowing residential usage on non-resident only parking and Halloween parking or October parking restricted streets. What community conversations occurred around that to those that would be impacted by allowing to rent out spots within those areas?
So you would not be allowed to rent out your spots on resident parking restricted streets?
Right, sorry, I mean
Yeah.
reverse, the ones that...
I mean, we did not send out a notification to every single parcel owner on every single resident parking street. I mean, the public hearing was posted, I think, and advertised properly, and the zoning ordinance was published properly. There's a degree to which I think the public is informed through those mechanisms about things that are coming before them, but we don't have the capacity to send out, for example, a citywide mailing every single time there's a proposal coming before the council that may or may not affect a property owner. So I think they had the opportunity through the public hearing, they had an opportunity at the planning board, they have an opportunity at OLA.
Thanks. So if I may, through the chair to you, I would just add that the community conversation that would be needed, I would think with this major change, occurred through the joint public hearing notification. I mean, I'm obviously not asking for a mailing to be sent out to everyone that would be affected by this, but I do feel that the city does have channels to have these conversations. For example, the Transportation Commission. We have the Transportation Commission to have conversations exactly like this. Also, for example, working with the ward councilors whose neighborhoods would be affected the most with this. We have our own channels that could process this and reach out to our constituents and see who would be interested, who would not be interested in it. And I don't think the joint public hearing, which it was kind of confusing and no additional communication around it, really checked off that box enough. So it's really my only question.
So I'm going to note for anyone at home who might be tuning in, the webinar ID is 818-934-02938. And it looks like Councilor Watson-Felt was able to join via that webinar ID. Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Not being a member of the committee, do you have an idea of a sense of how much revenue this could bring in, out of curiosity?
I don't, because we don't know how many properties would register and how many spaces and how many days they would register. Until, it is in effect. We have 31 days in October. They're probably not going to register every space every day. We do know that, bear with me, in 2024, the number of spaces requested under the existing October overlay ordinance was 1,431. That is just within the zone that's allowed under the existing ordinance. And that's the total number of spaces, not the number of space days that were available.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just excited about ways to get more money from tourists, and the Transportation Enhancement Fund finding, more sustainable funding like this says is exciting. So just was curious about that. Thank you.
Councilor Merkel.
Thank you, Chair Hepworth, not being a member of the committee. I just had a point of clarity so that I'm understanding it correctly. So the resident would request and would decide and request how many spots they want to rent and on what days. So if a resident had a long driveway, let's say, that had 4 spots, but they think, I'll just rent out 2, and maybe I only want to do it Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So they could really design, what they want to to do, and then they only pay for what they propose they want to rent out. Is that how it works? And I also see it's a lot of the downtown is, and a lot of the resident parking, all of this on the grid is not included. So it's other neighborhoods. But yes, that's basically what this looks like. They have that flexibility.
So that's correct. You would register with the city the number of days annually. There's a $100 registration fee regardless of the size of the lot. And you would register, I'm selecting these 10 days in October. I'm going to have 2 spaces in my driveway that will be available. And based on that, the city will know after the season how much to assess and the surcharge, assuming the home rule petition moves through the legislature. Most of the downtown area where the October resident parking streets are currently placed, those are served by those 1,400 existing spaces in the existing overlay zone, which are all commercial. They are additionally served by the city's several thousand public parking spaces. But I think the intention, and we talked about this at the joint public hearing, but the intention of excluding the resident parking streets is if you have 2 neighbors, one of whom, on that street, one of whom has a driveway and one of whom does not, that resident who does not have an off-street parking option relies on the off-street space, and their neighbor could choose to rent the driveway out, move their car onto the street, and you've got a tourist vehicle parking in that driveway, but it is, the net effect is effectively placing a tourist vehicle displacing a resident parking option.
Yes, thank you. I agree with that. Yes, we certainly don't want to take their spots up. And also, I agree with extending the red circle for the commercial, the red lining for the commercial allowed parking. I was never a fan of that arbitrary red circle, so expanding that citywide, I'm definitely in support of, and thank you for the clarity.
Councilor Marcelo.
Thank you, Chair. I also am definitely in favor of increasing the zone for the whole city. My only question is, I can't say that I've walked all over the city in October, but the only areas where I've seen people selling parking spaces is in the downtown, where now they can't do it. So are we trading in one kind of enforcement for another? Are we going to have to then be doubling down and enforcing illegal rental of space in these areas where it's not allowed, which is where it was happening?
I don't know. I mean, it would be conjecture for me to say if that's the case or not. I mean, I think that the trade-off is if we allow for it on the resident parking streets, it significantly disadvantages the residents who don't have off-street parking on those streets. And then you're, I think, contending with another challenge and another enforcement issue, just a different section of the code that we'd be enforcing.
I mean, I would agree. I think that, yeah, I guess I'm still trying to figure out the private property use, the driveway use. Do we have any idea of how many calls there were for enforcement of illegal driveway use?
So last October, the building department was called out 73 times to issue tickets for this particular kind of violation. And I just also want to, I don't think I clarified, on the resident parking restricted streets, the prohibition effectively on renting out of private parking spaces applies to residential property. It doesn't apply to a commercial lot that might, or driveway that might be in the resident zone.
So you had, I'm sorry, how many?
73.
73 people were using their personal property.
73 tickets were issued.
Does that include commercial property also? Or is this just private homes?
I believe that it's just on residential properties, but I would have to confirm that. Let me confirm with the building inspector. I only know that the total number of tickets issued was 73.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Zoning tickets, yeah.
Councilor Jerslow.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor, I know of 2. One was a commercial on Webb Street, and one was a church on Forrester Street. I don't know where a church falls, if it's commercial or, yeah.
No, spiritual.
Councilor Stott.
Thank you. To tag off of that conversation, so I asked this earlier via email. You said the 73. They were called on 73 times, and citations were issued on, and you listed out streets. Every single street that was listed out is in the restricted parking area, whether it be Halloween, I keep calling it Halloween, October restricted parking or resident restricting parking. So I totally agree with my colleague that we're just going to continue to have that problem if they would still not be allowed to have the restricted park or the pay parking in this new ordinance change. And then the one note about not allowing those in that area to sell out their private parking puts them at a significant disadvantage over other streets that don't have the restricted parking. I think that that's a really broad statement to make without really looking into those other neighborhoods that don't have the restricted parking. I think that other neighborhoods that don't have restricted parking also fight for street parking. It's just kind of at that balance where you can kind of get by, and it's not really an issue because I've literally been holding up a wall for a couple of years of saying, no, we're not increasing the Halloween October parking in North Salem because it's just a couple weekends, it's not as bad, and it's an increased cost to add those streets onto it. But if we now allow this in there, 100% we would need to increase and add the streets that have the restricted parking, so those that do live in those areas have street parking available to them, which right now it's at that really close line, that tipping point, and I think this 100% would tip it over. But that's my assumption. I haven't done any community conversations or additional research into it or had that broad conversation. I think it's something that needs to happen and should happen, maybe next year, but I think adding both of these changes of one increasing the trying not to say blob, increasing the circle to make it be citywide, and adding this ability for residential parking is just messy, and it's going to add a lot of confusion that is not going to help assist with your goals of enforcement and making sure we're not adding extra undue burden. I think perhaps doing one thing at a time, like just adding or increasing the size to the entire city, is a great next step for improving the process that we have now after taking feedback from having it for a year or two. And then down the road, once those conversations have happened with the constituents that will mostly be affected, happen, then take that second step as well. But I think there was that huge piece that was missing, and a lot of broad statements and assumptions are being made about the effect that this would have on them.
Was there, I'll get to Councilor Cohen in just a second. Was there a consideration about just increasing the size of the zone to include all commercial properties in the city or all within a much larger space? Or was this always intended to extend to resident spaces?
I mean, it's certainly an option that's available if the council wanted to expand the zone but only include commercial properties. I think it doesn't do two things. It doesn't, I think, treat fairly the residents who are trying to find a way to, I think, bear the cost, their own burdens of dealing with October with their property in a limited fashion, in a regulated fashion. Additionally, constraining our ability to collect whatever we might be able to from a surcharge. So if we take those options off the table, to your point, Councilor, like we don't know what the revenue will be, but if there's no residential property included in that surcharge, then that's that much less revenue that we would possibly generate. And then additionally, I don't know, it's finding it's not fully addressing an enforcement challenge, so we'll still have to enforce when somebody's renting their driveway out and respond to those zoning violations. If of the 73 tickets that were issued, if 2 of those locations were a commercial or church, the rest were residential, which I think speaks to the fact that most of the time, the complaints that are coming into the building department, and I know that the building inspector is not able to be here tonight, but most of the time those complaints are coming in about somebody calling out to complain about a neighbor who's renting out their driveway. So those would continue to be things that we would have to address and respond to during the busiest time of year, really, for city staff. So I'm not saying that it's not a consideration that, would be a next step, that we could take that step and then assess whether or not that's working well, but those would be the trade-offs that I could see.
Yeah, I think just from my perspective, I think it is easy, even though I disagreed with the parking overlay initially, I think it was easy to look at a space and say, I know that that's doing that illegally, that's doing that legally, because you knew that it was it was only on a commercial property. I think it becomes harder this way. So if somebody says, my neighbor on Arbella Street is renting out their space, I can't off the top of my head tell you if Arbella Street is resident only or not resident only. I have to go look at the map and figure that out. And I think that it opens up the door for, probably to Councilor Morsillo's point, a lot more confusion around the enforcement and potentially more difficulty enforcing it. Whereas I think if the zone were expanded to just include all commercial properties in the city, I can see myself supporting something like that, because I think that's making things clearer and easier, and that's not a little less arbitrary potentially. Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Hapworth. So I'm super excited to extend this to the whole city for commercial properties. I think from an environmental standpoint, a congestion standpoint, and for sure an equity. But I'm really conflicted about the residential. And I have the smallest ward area-wise, so I have like a ridiculous amount of multi-unit properties. And I have a lot of resident parking around the college and whatever, and then I have a lot of non-resident parking. And ironically, the issues that I have are with, and I brought this up during the joint public hearing, there is a property on Lafayette Street that has a driveway in the back that can accommodate like 6 or 8 cars, and in October, the landlord forces everyone out, even though in the lease it says that they can park, that every unit has 1 spot, and that's not resident parking. And I have, even on my street, I have several buildings that either have no driveway or certainly not enough driveway to accommodate, because we don't allow tandem parking in the driveway. So I'm actually concerned, whether it's resident parking or not, about tenants being displaced out of their spots for this time, when the idea, like my street, is the border of the October overlay. So I don't have resident parking except for October. And if I didn't have resident parking in October, I would literally, if I was working in my old job, I'd literally was parking 5 or 6 blocks from my house, when I got home. So there's like so many people in the ward who, without that, are really encumbered to park. So I'm not sure that, one, the enforcement is like tenants are sometimes, afraid of, speaking against the landlord, even though in the lease they might have a spot. Does that make sense? And so I'm kind of concerned about the, maybe the unintentional consequence of this, where a lot of people will be renting out spots at the expense of their tenants. I don't know if that's something you guys have talked about.
Can I respond? So yeah, I think circulated the staff had developed some draft regulations following the joint public hearing. There was a request to see what would potentially be advanced to the commission. The commissioner was sent it for informational purposes. So I just want to be clear, it's a staff proposal. It's not something the commission has voted on, because I think we were waiting to see what the ordinance would look like itself. And one of those regulations does stipulate that that the owners of rental properties may not use designated tenant parking spaces for the October visitor parking overlay. So there was some discussion about that, recognizing that there's a concerns for there as well.
I appreciate that, and I saw that, and I thought, yeah, that sounds good, but I think it's more than enforcement. I'm just saying, like, you can only enforce something if someone lets the city know that there's a problem, right? Like, no one's going to drive by and say, oh, that tenant had a spot in the backyard. That's my point.
If I may, so, I mean, that's one of the benefits of having the registration process, is that we can identify this property as, you know, an 8-family property, you know, this lot is parking for those tenants. We are not going to allow them to register, and if they engage in that activity, it's a zoning violation, daily fee, fine, $300.
Councillor Stott.
Thank you, Chair. Not being a member of the committee, I just want to echo what Councillor Cohen said, that I fully agree that like tenants are not one to complain about their landlords, especially to the city, and that would put them in a very precarious situation that I would not want them to be put in. I wanted to comment, though, about the equitable comment that you made about enabling Salem residents that really feel the brunt of October businesses to benefit from this by renting it. But I feel like those Salem residents are the ones that live downtown, the ones that have the restricted parking, the ones that have the October parking. And it's even, I think, more confusing and less equitable to then say, oh, but not you. You can't actually benefit from this. So while I appreciate the intent and the idea and the creative solutioning that you're trying to do here, I don't like it. I think more conversation needs to happen.
May I just briefly respond? I think that the benefit that those residents have is that they have the privilege of being able to have protected parking on the street. That's a public space that is private parking for them. You know, those are I think that's a trade-off, that they don't have the ability to generate revenue from this proposal, but they do have privileged access to a public street that even other residents of the city don't have.
Right, but that's not a trade-off because they have that now. So then in addition, they're now also being told they cannot generate revenue, but others can. Anyway, I see what you're saying, though. I will finally say that while I am not a member of the committee, I definitely would make a motion, if I was, to amend the ordinance to only include commercial properties. I will say I did run some suggested language by the city solicitor, keeping it pretty simple and within the four corners. But I have that. I'm just blabbering. So basically, and I can share this with anyone, that it would change, removing out the verbiage that says, this would all be a deletion, except for residential lots located on a street designated for either resident permit parking section 75 or October resident parking section 75. So deleting all of that and putting right in front of it any non-resident lot. So each year during the period beginning on Friday to after October 31st, off-street parking spaces located on any non-residential lot, may be used for independent public parking. So that's kind of how our current ordinance is written. I am also adding in a line that was in the old one of parking on any lot shall only be permitted in spaces that are lawfully existing off-street parking. And then that would be really the only edits that I would request, and I can share this with the committee if interested.
The final edit was at the end. Is that correct? Right after parking garage?
I can share with the class.
I'll make a motion to amend the ordinance as stated and blue-lined here. Blue-lined and deleted.
The motion from Councillor Morcillo to accept Councillor Stott's amendment to effectively remove resident spaces from this ordinance to make it only commercial spaces. Seconded by Councillor Cohen. Any other discussion, Councillor Morcillo?
Thank you, Chair. So I like the incremental approach that we're taking to trying to figure out this beast that is October parking. I do agree. I think we need more information on who's interested in doing this, and I think we just need more information. I think that the violations that you got were mostly in the area that is going to be restricted now. And so I still think they're going to try to do it. And so you're still going to have the violation. So I'm not sure what we're fixing here. I think that there is potential, though, for this. And I do think that there are some people who would be interested in renting out their driveway space. But I do agree with Counselor Stott that this is going to put more strain on the edges of this colored map, right? Which is what we're trying not to expand it, but it is going to affect that area outside of the downtown Halloween parking area.
Well, if I may, so with the amendment, it wouldn't, right? Because that would only apply, the restriction on the resident parking streets only applies if you're allowing residents to use their.
Correct. That's why I think we need more information from residents on if they're interested in this, how they're going to use this, what areas it's going to affect, what are we not thinking of here? If there's a lot of people that really are interested in this, I just don't know if that is true. I haven't gotten a whole lot of feedback from people who said that wow, this is amazing, and I'm going to rent out my driveway space. And most of my ward is outside of that restricted area. So I do want more information, and I'm not saying it's a terrible idea. I think that there's potential. I just don't know enough about it yet.
Councilor Jerslow, then Councilor Stott.
Thank you, Chair. I have to disagree. The 73 violations, I think, were mostly in Ward 1 and Ward 2. So residents are interested. Most of them, the only 3 ones I knew were Mike's Mobile was a commercial lot on Webb Street, and the church. The rest of them were residential properties. So I think it is an interest for the residents to do this. No, some of them weren't. They were actually, let's see, Forrester Street. They were in that area off of Webb Street, Briggs Street. I don't know if you have a list of. No, Forrester's.
Just make sure we're keeping the conversation on the microphone.
Forester is restricted because it's October resident parking.
Okay. Well, there was another one. I think actually, well, I know some of my residents that had it were violated.
Right. I mean, I don't want.
Councilor Marceau.
And the commercial spaces that you mentioned would be able to do it now because we're going to be increasing the overlay for the whole city. So it's really just the private properties. And as Councilor Stott said, she looked through the list of violations and they were in the restricted areas. So that's.
Councilor Stott, and then Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair, not being a member of the committee. I just wanted to echo what I said earlier, that I appreciate the creative problem solving, and I hate having to throw away the whole idea of the allowing residential private property to be included in this, but I just think it needs to be sussed out a little more. There are too many questions of what are the downstream effects going to be here, mostly being the request for restricted parking expansion. What's the cost for that? How's the enforcement of that going to happen? All of those things. So I think an incremental approach is a good idea. We can take stock of how this change affects next year and then have the whole year to continue to have that conversation, which I'm happy to help with.
Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. To Councilor Jerslow's point, I'm actually not adverse to residential component. I just feel like even just in this, I've always been adverse to the idea that it can happen and it can affect tenants, in a bad way. But even just in this conversation we've had, I think there's more information. Just like Councilor Marcello, I have plenty of places that could accommodate this, and no one's actually said, why can't I charge for my parking spot? I mean, I have some residential areas that the parking looks commercial, you know what I mean? It's like I have some pretty big buildings, that have, 60 units in them. So I just think that we can maybe get there. I just don't feel like we're there yet. And I think that, the conversation we're having now, maybe what can be done to survey the public a little better.
Councilor Jerslow, then Councilor Merkel.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to clarify the people that I was talking about. It was before October. It wasn't during the October resident parking only, it was in September that they were violated. That's why I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Councilor Merkel.
Thank you, Chair Hapworth, not being a member of the committee. I just had a question. I don't see, the $2 per space in addition to the $100 registration fee. Is that part of, the commercial? That doesn't, that's not applicable to this? I'm just a little confused.
It is. It was separately filed as a home rule petition because it has to go to the legislature for a special act. So there's the larger conversation I think has been happening around the zoning ordinance. Also posted on the agenda for tonight's discussion and filed along with this was the home rule petition for that. So the $2 is in that. And I do want to point out that we did include an inflationary adjustment to that so that we can make sure that we don't have to go to the legislature should they choose to allow this this special act. We wouldn't have to go back to them if we wanted to make adjustants to the surcharge.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. I didn't know where the $2 was landing.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for that clarity.
So to be clear, the $2 would apply to, in this case, if this amendment were to pass, to just commercial spaces going forward. There's no changes needed on.
That's correct. Yeah, the home rule petition language doesn't specify commercial or residential, doesn't distinguish resident parking streets. That's entirely in the zoning. The home rule petition only speaks to an operator registered with the city who transfers the right to use a parking space in return for consideration during the period beginning, et cetera, et cetera.
Councilor Marcel.
Thank you, Chair. One last comment. I don't think I see it in the regulations, but if we could have a list of all of the permitted spots in the city for parking on the website so that people can easily find that list, that would be really helpful.
Yes, I think we talked about that in the joint public hearing, that part of the idea with the easing of enforcement is to make that list available so that people can understand which properties are allowed to be doing this and which ones aren't, and hopefully we'll only call to report the ones that are not registered.
Right, so if that could be part of the regulations, just so that we don't forget to do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, we'll look at that for sure.
All right, we have an amendment in front of us. Any more conversation before? Any questions about the amendment that we would be voting on? Seeing none. Okay, so on Councilor Morcillo's amendment, all those in favor? Any opposed? I see 3 hands plus my own in favor. The matter carries. Any other conversation or questions about either the regulations or the ordinance here, and then we'll move to the home rule petition. Seeing none. Councilor Prosnewski.
Not being a member of the committee, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm just scratching my head, Mayor, about the areas that get designated for residential parking during October. Those people will not be able to rent out their spaces because they are getting the privilege of parking out in the street, correct?
Well, under the amendment that was just passed, that's no longer applicable because it only applies to commercial properties.
Only applies to, so people that, first of all, I'm glad to see that this bubble is dissolved. I think that goes to the
Blob.
the blob, the bubble, the line, whatever, the blob. But the other part of it was, is the city going to be talking about a set fee for how much residents or properties can charge for renting spaces during Halloween? Is there any talk about, because some places charge, I mean, 5-6 years ago, they were charging $50 a space, and some other people are charging $10, $20 a space. Has there been any talk about the ones that we're going to be in charge of enforcing? Is there going to be a fee structure set for that?
That's not proposed in the regulation. That's been drafted, so.
Okay. Okay. All right, that's it for now. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we move to a vote on this? Seeing none, so the ordinance as amended, all those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. All right, and we'll move on to the home rule petition. Sorry. I think the intent of that vote was to refer that back to the full council with a positive recommendation, but we can take as amended. but we'll take that vote again. So okay, Counselor Cohen.
I move that we refer the amended ordinance to the full council with a positive recommendation.
Counselor Cohen moves to refer to the full council as amended with a positive recommendation, seconded by Counselor Morcillo. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. All right, on to the home rule petition. Any questions, comments, or concerns from the council? For the people at home, Mayor Pangala, do you want to just briefly explain what this home rule petition would accomplish?
Yep. So this petition would authorize the city to assess an excise of $2 per space per day for any public parking on private property authorized by the zoning code. As I mentioned, the rate established by this is similar to that authorized to the cities of Boston, Springfield, and Worcester pursuant to the Convention Center Financing Act. While those revenues are used to support the city's convention centers, the special act proposed for Salem would direct these revenues to our Transportation Enhancement Fund to provide a more sustainable funding source for programs like our on-demand rideshare shuttle, the Salem Skipper, and our bike share program, Blue Bikes. The language of the special act authorizes the city to increase the rate annually by 25 cents. I think that pretty much summarizes it.
Any questions or comments or concerns? Counselor Jerslow.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question. How are they, say Mike's Mobile, say they're going to have 20 spaces, but they're only registering 10 with you, and they're still renting out 20 or 30. Are you going to be enforcing that?
Yep. So the intention would be to conduct random audits of the registered properties in the violation of your registration. So if you say, for example, I'm registering 10 spaces, but I'm renting out 20 and not telling you about the other 10, results in both a fine and also the loss of the ability to register that property in future years.
Thank you.
All right. So on the home rule petition, any motions? Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. I move that we refer this to the full council with a positive recommendation.
Councilor Cohen moves to refer to the full council with a positive recommendation, seconded by Councilor Jerslow. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter carries. All right. Anything else?
Motion to adjourn.
Councilor Morcillo moves to adjourn. All those in favor? Any opposed? Matter. We are adjourned. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome. It was fun. Let's do this again sometime soon.